should take that on the road. That was very nice. So good morning again. So you're the ones that set your clocks. The others should be with us in about a half an hour. Or they're watching at home. So, yeah. So what is reality? Is daylight savings time reality? Well, that's right. It's an agreed upon confection, if you will, that we all agree that this is the time and how we'll set it and what we'll do and all that. Somebody said time isn't real, but clocks are. So this is part of a three-part series. Last week we talked about the first part of the book I wrote called Sacred Thinking, and it was about the idea of defining spirit, to getting a sense of what is the nature of that creative intelligence of the universe. And we gave out a worksheet for creating your own definition of that, and there are some in the on the counter in the bookstore if you weren't here last week or you want to get another one. The center piece of the book, the second section, is about the nature of reality, and reality is something that we all co-create together. There is, it seems like there's something we would call an objective reality out there, but more and more what we're discovering through science and through other observations are what the mystics have been saying for thousands of years, that there isn't really an objective reality out there per se. It's there, but our experience of it has very little, sometimes nothing, to do with what's really there. Your reality is created within your own mind in terms of how you experience the world around you, how you experience yourself. And I'll give you an example, Has anyone ever had a misunderstanding? Where you believed something was true and you found out it wasn't true? Okay, well, but while you believed it was true, it was part of your reality, right? Even though it wasn't objectively so, you acted as if it was so, conducted yourself accordingly, as they would say. And for that period of time, you just assumed that that's what's so. By the way, you're doing the same thing right now. We probably all have we all have some misunderstandings about things that we haven't discovered are misunderstandings yet. And so we act as if they're true. Okay? Teilhard de Chardin, who was a great Jesuit mystic, said, "We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience." Now, that's a fairly profound statement. It's one that probably, to a great extent, contradicts the evidence of your senses. It certainly contradicts whatever you read in the newspaper this morning, because it doesn't look like, when you read the news or watch the news or get it online, however you get your news, it doesn't look like this is an example of spiritual beings having a human experience, does it? Seems like we're very disconnected from that aspect of spirit, if in fact it exists at all. Well, that's a misunderstanding too. See, that's just an example of a great misunderstanding that is shared by, I don't know, maybe the majority of people on the planet. That they're separate from any idea of something divine. And I'm not talking about a divinity of some personality, sitting in a big office up in heaven with a white suit on. I'm talking about a divine reality that is the essence or the intelligence or the energy out of which we arise. We arise out of that spiritual reality into this physical reality, which is made up of the spiritual reality, but quite frankly, sometimes the spiritual part of it's well disguised. We say everything is spirit, but some of it's well disguised. So what do we do with that? Well, we have to somehow come to see that as initially we have to see it as possible. And then we have to gradually do our work, our spiritual practice, which we'll talk about next week, in order to reinforce that idea of accepting what all the great mystics and spiritual teachers have said is a greater truth than is visible. A greater truth than is visible. We see through appearances, through what we call the world of effect or condition, to a greater truth beyond it, which you can't physically see, but you can feel it. You can have a sense of it. Sometimes, people have what we call mystical experiences where they have a sense of oneness with everything. The self falls away. And they have that experience. Is that any less real or more real than the experience we're having right now? Or is it all real? Or is any of it real? We talk about things being an illusion, which is not to say, the chair you're sitting in is not an illusion, but your experience of the chair, the way you think about it, could be. In fact, it probably is, because we don't know the chair in all its ways of being. We talked a little bit last week about that. If you were the size of an electron, you'd fall right through the chair. Because if you were the size of an electron, you were in the chair, the next electron would seem like the distance from here to the next planet in the solar system. Because almost all of the chair is space. And almost all of you is space. What's holding it together, in any sense? Well, we don't really know, except it seems to be its nature to be held together. Is that spirit expressing? Or is it just random chance that those atoms, the 30 or 40 trillion or so it takes to make up that chair, just happen to come together in that formation? And what if they decide to leave in the middle of my talk? Then where will you be? Well, for a second you'll be suspended in air, right? Like Yosemite Sam when he runs off the cliff. And then you'll probably be on the floor, and you hope the atoms there don't decide to desert you, or you could fall right through the earth. So this idea of reality is something that we have to understand, that as human beings, our mind, our psychology, we construct our version of reality. And you can see this every day. You ever had the experience of you and someone else looking at the same thing and seeing something different? Like maybe, if you were a young girl at one point and you brought home this fellow you thought was just terrific, and your parents looked at him and saw something completely different. And you said, "But Mom, he's so great, he just got out of prison. He's paid his dues. I don't know what your concern is." And she had a different experience of that individual. But you're both just projecting yourselves onto him and having that as your experience. So we do that all the time, really. You may find people you agree with about certain things, but even they are not seeing exactly the same thing in the same way that you are. So it's kind of an interesting thing. It's sort of like a house of mirrors that we've been dropped into. And we see reflections of our projection in all different elements of the world around us, and we think we're interacting with the world objectively and reasonably when we're not. I was talking earlier with Joe in the back. He was watching some stuff in I guess a trial or something going on in Arizona. And, if you've ever been on jury duty, or you've been on trial, or you've been, in that kind of a setting, it's really interesting because in court, they say what we're looking for is the objective truth, which doesn't exist. If you've ever been in court, you probably know that. And I remember when I was a police officer, just a quick aside here, there was a judge in traffic court in Miami. His name was Stanley Goldstein, and he had been a motorcycle cop before he became a judge. So his courtroom was really interesting. And he was in the district. He was his court was where I worked. So about 3 or 4 days a week, I would tend to be in his court for something. And he would start out with a room full of people, kind of like this, and he'd say, "Okay, here's the deal. You've all got traffic tickets. You essentially have 3 choices. You can plead, if you want to plead guilty, you can plead guilty, you can plead not guilty, or you can plead what's called nolo contendere, or, really doesn't plead anything. It says, if you're pleading guilty, if you're here to plead guilty, please leave the room, pay the clerk. And a bunch of people would get up and leave. And he said, okay, so I assume the rest of you are either going to plead not guilty or no contest, which nolo contendere means. And he says, okay, if you're going to do that, there's a couple of things you can't do. Your defense can't be that the cop's a liar or the cop's crazy. So about 2/3 of the people would get up and leave to go pay the ticket. And he says, and if you do come up here and your defense is that the cop's a liar or the cop's crazy, I'm going to fine you an extra $100 in court costs. Then about another whole group would get up and leave. And eventually there would be about 6 people sitting there, and we'd go to trial, and inevitably 3 or 4 of those would say the cop's a liar or the cop's crazy. It was kind of interesting. And he would do what he said he was going to do, But it was that, so you say, what's the reality there? What if the cop was a liar or the cop was crazy? I mean, not me, but there were other cops that might be. But it was always interesting to me when people would contest a ticket that I had written, and I'd gone through the whole experience, and what I did on my copy, I wrote down the whole conversation we had, because you learn the hard way. And people would get up, and I had people get up and say they'd never seen me before, that they were never stopped. And I'm like, this was like 10 days ago, I'm like, I remember you, No, I was never pulled over. Someone else must have taken my car and taken my ID, and, And the judge, that happened, the judge would say, okay, I should have added, your defense can't be that you're crazy. Said you can't plead insanity in a traffic case. So, but it was all an interesting juxtaposition of differing realities, and it can get very confusing. And fortunately, this judge had sort of a sense of humor about the whole thing, because when the judge doesn't have a sense of humor and he thinks there is only one reality, then court gets very difficult. Okay. So some of the aspects of reality, and these are basically how the chapters in this part of the book unfold. The first thing is called understanding and perspective. So my perspective, which simply means the place from which I stand or which I view something, determines a great aspect of how I experience reality. If you're in New York City, let's say, and you're down in the middle of Times Square, it looks like total chaos. There's thousands of people going in all different directions. It just seems like it has no pattern. But if you get in and go into one of the high rises there and go up in the elevator and go up and look down from a high floor, you can see there's patterns to the way people are moving. Some are getting on the subway, some are getting off, some are going into businesses and so forth. So from that higher perspective, you get a sense of order that doesn't exist from the perspective on the ground. So that's what perspective is. So a perspective is, how am I looking at this? And perspective is not just where you stand, but psychologically, where are you coming from? Have you just had a bad day? Are you dealing with something that you really fear? That all affects your perspective from which you experience something. All right? And how you come to understand it is based on your perspective. The other is this aspect of translation or transformation, and this has to do with religion or theology and how it's expressed. And it's 2 levels. Translation is the level of normally religious teaching, but it can be any kind of teaching, that talks about basically right and wrong. That basically says, here's what your life is, and here's how it translates into our understanding or our creed. Okay? So the 10 Commandments are an example of translation level of religion. And then transformation is is change at depth. It's a change in perspective that results from a significant change at depth within the person. Okay, the prayer of St. Francis is an example of a transformational prayer. Where basically in that prayer he's turning himself over completely in surrender to what he calls Lord, what we would say the term would be law, to turn myself over to the inner wisdom within and not try to let my diminished self direct my experience. That's a transformational approach. Okay, we'll talk more about these in a minute. Freedom versus bondage. One of the basic messages of our teaching that Dr. Holmes really stressed is that we should be living lives of spiritual freedom. Spiritual freedom meaning that we are free to use this vehicle, our psychology, our minds, in any way that brings us fulfillment and joy, and we are responsible to use it as wisely as we can. But that we shouldn't be held in bondage by accepting ideas and strictures and dogma from others that may not work for us. Okay? And then conscious evolution, which is a recognition that we are now, as self-aware beings, we are actually capable of directing our own evolution. And there's lots of evidence that points to this. There's lots of studies that show that human beings, you, actually change and reprogram your DNA by the way that you think and feel. And if you change and reprogram your DNA and then you reproduce, you have changed evolution consciously. So we have this capacity, and we are in fact doing this all the time in terms of how we think and feel. The question is, are we doing so in a truly conscious way, or is it happen kind of by default? So the next version of humanity that shows up, the next species on the ladder, will be the result of a consciously directed evolutionary process for the first time in history. It's both exciting and a little terrifying when you think about how most people think. Not you all, but other people. So that's another aspect of reality that's a big part. And then there's this concept. I got this from a couple of books by a guy named William Pirsig. He wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and Lila. And they're both excellent books. They're novels, but they're really philosophy books. And one element of his model on value is looking at value static versus dynamic. Static is standing still, dynamic is moving. And his point is that dynamic value always takes precedence over static value. That which is standing still is less than that which is in motion, because it's the nature of everything actually to be in motion. In fact, nothing is standing still. It's all an illusion. The chair you're sitting in, you might be thinking it's standing still, but there's probably more movement in that chair than you could comprehend with your mind if you could actually see it all. Every atom is vibrating. Every electron is appearing and disappearing. And that's also happening within you. We're all sitting here dancing in a frenzy at the atomic level. You're not just moving, you're moving. And it's kind of interesting, you know. Yet part of our perspective is that, no, I'm sitting still. I'm static right now. And not only you're moving at the cellular level, you know, the planet's spinning at a certain speed, I forget what it is, and the planet's moving in orbit around the sun, and the solar system is moving through the Milky Way, and the Milky Way is moving, and we think we're standing still. That's a mistaken perspective at every level of being. Kind of interesting. But how often does that govern your experience of reality? That nothing's happening, my life is static, everything's standing still. When really you're a dynamic being that is moving so quickly in so many ways that it's almost impossible to comprehend. Aldous Huxley said, "The nature of truth cannot be described by means of verbal symbols that do not adequately respond to it. At best, it can be hinted at." On perspective. So our language is very limited in its capacity to really convey what's really going on. For one thing, language is divisive. I mean, to make a word, you're dividing things up. And our true experience, it seems, the true nature of reality is unitive. We don't have language to describe a unitive experience. Because as soon as you try to talk about it, you've stepped into another version of reality. So the mystics go crazy trying to say what they've experienced when they can't even make it so they understand what they're saying. Kind of interesting. Translation versus transformation is, you know, am I changing colors as a duck, or am I becoming a fish in this particular Magritte illustration? Change can be horizontal, kind of like if you rearrange the furniture in your house. Or it can be vertical, where you get a new house. Vertical change is much more transformative. You know, it's like going from a child to an adolescent to an adult is transformative, and that's something that kind of happens to us, at least physically. Doesn't always happen mentally. That's what they call arrested development, where you get stuck in a previous state mentally, even though your body has gotten bigger, or older. But when we also, because we direct that change, we direct the interior change. The physiological change just kind of happens because it's in your programming and your DNA to do that. But we have the capacity to stunt our growth mentally because why do we do that? We do that because we take a limited perspective on life. Why do we do that? Because other people with a limited perspective on life suggest that's what we should do, and we believe them. Do you know anybody that's kind of stuck in an earlier stage of development? Don't look around the room. Just keep your eyes forward. Yeah. Maybe that's happened to you at some point in your life, where you didn't quite grow up. And then when we don't grow up, it's kind of interesting. We do live in a cooperative universe that wants us to continue to evolve and grow. So the universe has a way of setting us straight, in the sense of when you fall off the path, the universe will kind of at first gently try to nudge you back onto the path. And then if you don't listen to that, if you don't pay attention, it'll kind of start to bump up against you. And then if that doesn't work, it'll take out a hammer and start pounding you in the head. And I'll give you an example of that. Let's say that you're living a typical American lifestyle, which means you're not eating very good food, you're eating too much of it, you're sedentary too much of the time, and things like that, which is not an uncommon perspective and experience for folks in our culture. Well, what will begin to happen is there'll be some subtle signs that you're off the beam, some subtle signs like you'll feel uncomfortable. It's like, I don't feel as good as I used to. I'm tired. I don't move around. And you say, well, that's the way it is. Let's go get a supersized Big Mac. Maybe I'll feel better. So you go you have your super-sized Big Mac, and all that. And then you start to get headaches, and you're like, God, what's going on with these headaches? I don't understand it. Maybe you get a little rash, a little psoriasis or something, what's going on? Because there's like all these toxins in your body that are coming to the surface now because you weren't listening to the subtle signs, and the universe is going to raise its voice. And you say, well, gee, I'll just get some cream and put on that, and put it on that, and I'll take a pill for the headache. And if the headaches get worse, I'll go to the doctor and get a prescription. There are now 2 prescriptions outstanding for every person in the United States. Every person in the United States has an average of 2 prescriptions. Okay, some of you are going, only 2? So that's an indication now the universe is raising its voice a little more, and the over-the-counter stuff ain't cutting it, right? But you continue to live the same kind of lifestyle, You say, yeah, they got a healthy eating group at the center, but, They never have pizza or anything, so. And I have so few joys in life. Okay. And I drive past the gym every day. What was that little cartoon I saw on the line that said, my yoga pants have never been to yoga? Give me a big giant Coke, will you? I feel better. So then you're still not listening. So So then you're kind of you're getting out of bed one morning, and all of a sudden there's this clutching in your chest, and you're laying on the floor. And next thing you know, you're getting a ride in an ambulance, and you go to the hospital, and they say you had a heart attack, or you had something, a stroke, or you had something. You need to change your lifestyle. Isn't there an operation or a pill I can take? In a study done in the 1990s, given the choice between a major lifestyle change and major surgery, 84% chose surgery. So then you see, I remember in my neighborhood in Fort Lauderdale, you would see, where, you know, you'd see it around here too, but I've noticed it there. You'd see these like 55, 60-year-old men out walking, and you've never seen them before. And every now and then, you know, warm weather, open collar shirt, you'd see the tape up here from the surgery, with the open heart surgery or whatever it was. And they'd be out walking, and you'd see them about 4 times, and then you'd never see them again. Because they walked 4 times, and then they said, well, the hell with this. You know. So the universe is now screaming at you, and you're still not listening. So then you die prematurely. And maybe you get the point at that point. I don't know. There's no evidence beyond that. We don't know what happens after that. But this is not an unusual pattern. It really isn't. And part of it comes from what are my capabilities in this life? How do I feel about myself? Do I love and respect myself? Have I been taught to do that? Has that been modeled for me as I grew up? Do I even think I deserve to be well? Do I think I have within me the capacity and the stamina and whatever is required to move forward through a process of transformation? Because usually by the time the universe is screaming at you, horizontal change isn't going to be enough. It's going to require that vertical change, that transformational change. Am I ready for that? And the reality is, yes, you always are. You know, in the New Testament, Jesus says, behold, I make all things new. And the reality of that teaching is that you are never bound by your history. We say in our teaching, principle is never bound by precedent. That no matter what you've done up to this moment, you can go 180 degrees in the opposite direction if you so choose, and if you're willing to deal with the pushback that will come mainly from within yourself. Your old patterns, your old way of being that's been justifying this pathway to destruction all along. You just have to work your way back through that, and it can be kind of tangly to get through that. Rumi says, this is about transformational change. Out there beyond right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down on that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other do not make any sense. Can we get beyond right doing and wrong doing? Can we get behind the small translational mind that wants to put a label on everything? And then when we label ourselves, it wants us to live up to that label. I'm a loser. I'm not very bright. I'm not very good looking. I'm not very talented. And once I label myself that way, I really resist letting go of that. Because part of me is designed to protect whatever label I put on myself. So knowing that, I need to put on better labels. You're not leftovers. You're the main course. You're designed to come here in this experience and thrive. But so often we become convinced of something else. And that's the greatest misunderstanding of all. That we're disconnected, that we don't deserve good, that we're judged by our past behavior, that we're subject to the heredity of our family. Every generation outlives their parents. That's the design. Yet how many of us get scared when we start to get near the age where our parents died? We need a bigger idea of who and what we are. Ernest Holmes said on freedom and bondage, we want to set ourselves free. So he says, to suppose that the creative intelligence of the universe would create man in bondage and leave him bound would be to dishonor the creative power that we call God. What seems to be bondage is simply the process by which we have to grow through, like the shoot has to break through the ground in order to thrive. But that's its nature. Your nature is to thrive. Your nature is to be fully available, fully expressed. About conscious evolution, Barbara Marx Hubbard says, conscious evolution signals the evolution of evolution itself, from an unconscious to conscious choice. It means that we are becoming conscious of our effect on evolution and must learn to guide our new powers toward a life-affirming future. The old days of thinking things happen to me are gone. Nothing happens to you. Everything happens through you and as you. And everything that's in front of you right now is yours, or it wouldn't be there. So when you just think, is there anything in your life right now you're trying to avoid? That you're consciously putting energy into avoiding? Maybe it's income tax time, or is there a conversation you're avoiding? Are you avoiding the gym? Are you avoiding anything that's good for you? If it's in front of you, it's yours to do. Because on the other side of that challenge is a greater awakening and a greater experience. And you only get there by going through it. When we spend our energy trying to avoid anything that's negative, we miss half of life. And it's an illusion that you can only have the other half. You get the good and the difficult. It's all part of a package. Marianne Williamson once said, I learned to be happy when I was able to accept two things. Men leave and people die. So is there anything that you can't accept about reality that's causing you to diminish yourself in your experience of life? What am I suffering from? You know, as Gary Simmons said, who's the matter with you today? Robert Pirsig said on Static and Dynamic, the place to improve the world is first in one's own head and heart and hands, and then work out from there. Change is an inside job. All lasting change that will come in your life comes first from the inside and works its way out. We don't change by encountering something outside of ourselves. We change when we do the inner work of transformation. And it's what we were designed to do. It's not anything alien to us. So if you'd like to pick up a copy of the book, you can do that. I'd be happy to sign it. And just in closing about this topic, when someone says to you, what is reality? The best answer you can give is reality is what I make for myself. Because that's the reality you experience. And we want it to be as close to the dynamic truth of the universe as it can be, but it's never going to be perfectly there. If you're going to live in an illusion, it might as well be a good one. It might as well be one that uplifts you and uplifts the world, rather than one that says, poor me, and ain't it a shame. We're not here to be a clod of ailments, wondering why the world won't make us happy. We're here to bring the gift of ourselves to the world so that everyone has a chance to be happy, including us, including you, and including me. And so it is. Thank you.